So I need to tell you a little bit about my process of sermon preparation. I collect stuff during the week, little snippets and tidbits here and there, and then by the end it tends to take form, and there's always something, one or two things that get left on the cutting room floor. Well, this week there was something too good on the cutting room floor, so I'm going to do sort of a little short before the feature presentation here because I need to share this one thing with you. I put it up on Facebook. I don't know how many people saw it, but there was a friend of mine who sent me a picture of this page a day Christian calendar of inspirational Bible verses. And it was beautiful, kind of sepia toned, floral print border, an inspirational verse for every day. And this calendar suffered from the peril of taking tiny snippets of biblical text completely out of context and presenting them as these pearls of wisdom. And the error was particularly pronounced on the day that the calendar offered a short snippet from today's reading as an inspirational verse. Simply said, "If you fall down and worship me, everything will be yours." It's a lot less inspirational once you know who was saying it, because that, of course, is what the devil said to Jesus in the wilderness. "If you fall down and worship me, everything will be yours." So I couldn't resist sharing that with you, but it has nothing to do with the sermon. So if you haven't been paying attention up to this point, that's fine. Now the sermon begins. This story starts with Jesus high on life, full of the Spirit, the Gospel says, filled up with the Holy Spirit, in fact, still dripping wet from the waters of the Jordan River. Just before this story that we heard, Jesus has been baptized by John. And as John lowered him beneath the murky waves and lifted him back up, the heavens opened and a voice proclaimed, "You are my beloved. In you I am well pleased." The Spirit of God even descended like a dove. And so Jesus, the carpenter's son from Nazareth, has been anointed by river water to bring the good news of God's love to the world. And Jesus, whose very spirit hums with divine presence, has just heard the voice of God blessing him, naming him, sending him on his way. It must have been amazing. And so, the story goes, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. Now, Luke's version is a little softer around the edges here. In the Gospel of Mark, it goes a little faster. Here's how the story sounds in the Gospel of Mark. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart, the Spirit descending like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, my beloved. With you I am well pleased." And immediately the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. For 40 days, he was tempted by Satan, and the angels waited on him. Suddenly, in the Gospel of Mark, he's not led to the wilderness, but driven. And he doesn't even have a chance to go home to change into dry clothes. It's one of the biggest smash cuts in the Bible. 1 minute he's in the river being proclaimed God's beloved, the next in the wilderness with the devil. It seems strangely abrupt. That is, unless you've lived enough to know how much life is like that. Many of you know that I was a firefighter for 4 years before I became a minister, and when I was just starting out as a rookie, going through my first classes, a sage old fire chief right out of Central Casting sat down our little group of 18-year-old recruits to lay some knowledge on us. He had that sort of like weathered, world-weary face, trying to hide how much he really cared. Every day, he said. I'm not going to do the North Carolina accent. Every day, he said, you are going to meet somebody who's having the worst day of their life. Now, the class he was teaching was called Hose, Streams, and Water Appliances, and I don't remember much about that. I don't remember the correct pressure for the 2.5-inch fog nozzle. I don't really remember what friction loss is or any of those things. I remember two things from the class. First, I remember the feeling of getting knocked over backwards the first time I tried to hold the hose by myself. And the second thing I remember is that one line he said at the end of the day. Every day, you're going to meet somebody who is having the worst day of their life. Now, thankfully, it wasn't every day. But the one thing that I will remember most from those 4 years of work, the things that I will remember long after I have forgotten the rest, are the faces of people who had just seen their world fall apart. A sudden loss, or a life's worth of things up in smoke. Life can be abrupt. And chances are, you don't need me to tell you that. Chances are your life has had some of these smash cuts, too. Things are going along beautifully and according to plan, and then, just like that, they're not. Suddenly, Christ is famished. Out in the wilderness, alone, weary, hungry, and suddenly the glory of that amazing moment in the river seemed so distant that he could barely grasp it. The presence of God, which felt so profound, the joy that wrapped around him like a blanket, the voice that sounded as if it were right in his ear. It all suddenly feels so far away, and so the temptations that he faces are not generic. They're not concocted out of thin air. They are each a challenge to the very identity that God has proclaimed for him. Perhaps you were just meant to survive, the tempter whispers. Not really live. Here, these stones would make good bread. Perhaps you are meant to take control, the tempter whispers. Be self-reliant. You don't need to keep getting buffeted around by the spirit's whims. And all of that might sound strange. That is, unless, of course, those same demons have kept you up at night, too. Whispering that you are not worth as much as you thought, or that you have no reason for hope, or that if you just buckle down, you could take control if you really try. Or maybe your tempter whispers that just one drink, just this once, won't do anyone any harm. Or maybe your tempter whispers that it would just be easier to give up. Or maybe your tempter whispers that you should just endure the abuse. Perhaps your tempter whispers that it's all your fault. The truth is that this old story of the Bible can sound a little bit like a folk tale from a bygone time. It can seem like some old medieval painting with cloven-hooved devils wandering around with pitchforks, enticing poor unwitting farm folk towards sins. It can all seem a little bit old-fashioned, a little out of date, or at least in need of some revision. That is, unless your life has ever come crashing down. Unless, of course, these bad ideas have ever crept into your head. So the question for us is, how do we survive these moments with our souls intact? How do we endure the big and little temptations that claw at us? How do we come out on the other side? Here's what Jesus did. He stood in the truth of his identity when the tempter started to whisper to him. He remembered what God had said about him in the Jordan River. He remembered what he believed deep down his mission in the world was. He remembered who he was. He remembered whose he was. He stood in the truth of his identity so that when temptation whispered, "You could have unlimited power," he said, "I could. But that's not who I am. That's not what I was made to do." He stood in the truth of his identity. He remembered who he was. And so when temptation whispered, "Why not be reckless? Take a leap, just see." He said, "I could. But I have much to live for." He stood in the truth of his identity so that when temptation whispered, "You don't need anyone but yourself," he said, "No, I need God." These 40 days that Jesus spent out in the wilderness alone with his hardest thoughts, that's where we Christians got the idea for this 40-day season we call Lent. The season leading up to Easter. It's a stretch of time for heightened spiritual devotion and prayer. A time to take stock of our lives, our whole lives, the good and the bad, and to seek God's help with all the broken pieces of who we are. Lent is a time for turning away from the habits that distract us from God, from the habits that take us away from the life that God has called us to. That's what temptation is. It's some enticing habit that draws us away from the truth of who we are and whose we are. That's what temptation is. Not cloven-hooved devils with pitchforks. It's an enticing habit, a seductive idea that draws us away from the truth of who we are and whose we are. We are God's people, made in God's image, holy, good, and undeniably beloved. And whatever whispers something else to you is a temptation. Now, Lent is a popular time to give up chocolate, or to try to cut back on TV or get to the gym a bit more. Lent has become kind of a New Year's resolution take two. And that's great if that's what your temptations are. But if you are anything like me, there are bigger things that you need to turn away from. There are bigger things than chocolate impeding your faithful life. So what if this Lent you gave up indifference and avoided the temptation to shield yourself from the pain of the world? Or what if you gave up self-loathing and vowed to look in the mirror and notice beauty? Or what if you gave up self-deprecation and started believing that what you have to say matters? What if you gave up prejudice and committed to really knowing people for who they are before you make up your mind about them? It's all a little harder than just hiding the cookie jar, but it is much more likely to send the devil away with his tail tucked between his legs. And how might we do something so dramatic, even for just a few weeks? Well, what did Jesus do? Remember who you are. You are a creature made of dust. You are made from the same stuff as the soil and the stars. You were formed by God, who loves you madly, who cares for you ceaselessly and cherishes you dearly. Remember who you are. Remember whose you are. All our lives belong to God, and we live to make God's love come alive. Imagine yourself, if it helps, still dripping with the waters of baptism, claimed by God who made you who you are. That is who you are. That is whose you are. The temptations are lies. Very crafty, very seductive, brilliantly scathing lies that cut to the core of our deepest insecurities and prey on our worst fears, but they are not true. Here's what's true. You are beautiful. You are beloved. Every life is sacred. There is always hope. Death will not speak last, and God's love will never end. That's what's true. Remember it. And if someone tries to tell you something else, you can just answer like Jesus did. I am beloved.